Excellencies, Undersecretary Generals, ladies and gentlemen, welcome and thank you for joining us for this 10th commemoration of the International Day for the Elimination of Sexual Violence and Conflict. We will open this event with a video from Aisha, a survivor of conflict-related sexual violence in South Sudan. Her experience and that of all others who have faced conflict-related sexual violence is why we are here today. We thank her, we thank UNMISS, the UN mission in South Sudan, for the collaboration in putting together this video and for their steadfast support to survivors like Aisha. Thank you.
They grabbed me. Some grabbed me. I don't know how many were there because they covered my head. Then some grabbed the auntie. I was taken the other side. My auntie was taken the other side. They separated us. Separating us. Me, the other side where I went, things didn't go well with me. By that time where we was there. Even my auntie herself was, I think she was also in her pain the other side because she did not help me any. Even boiling for me water that you can bathe a bit, she couldn't. Then I was like, this life is going to be hard. With the all pain I had, I didn't have any option. I was like, now maybe I'm going to die. These are my ending days now. She knew that there is something, elder people. Yeah. Then she took me on aside. She was like, my daughter, what is it? Because that mama is a mother to my friend. Then we sat. I explained it to her everything. Mama had to get some tablets. She gave me two tablets of Panadol. I took just to relieve the pain. I took, then she boiled some water for me. I bathed. After bathing me, she gave me another cloth. I changed my clothes. Then we sat, but I was in pain. They took me to a hospital. I got medication. They found all means. They stitched me.
You were torn up?
Yes. They stitched me till I stayed in the hospital for some good days. They looked after me. They helped me. Now, the work I'm working, the way I am, I'm working with my boss and her being a survivor. That's why she's also engaging us in her organization. So we're working with her, and most of our work is about GBV, most of it.
Thank you, and apologies for the technical difficulties that we've just experienced. So I'd like to turn the floor over to His Excellency Ambassador Ricardo Lagorio, Permanent Representative of Argentina to the United Nations and co-host of this event. He assumed his position in March 2024. Prior to his appointment, he was Ambassador Extraordinary and Plenipotentiary of Argentina to the Russian Federation from 2017 to 2020, concurrently representing the country in Belarus, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Uzbekistan, and Turkmenistan. Excellency, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Good morning. Well, it's a pleasure to be with you and to be in this panel. Dear ladies, thank you for admitting me to sit with you. Very honored and pleased. First of all, I would like to thank the Special Representative of the Secretary General on Sexual Violence in Conflict and Under Secretary General Mrs. Pramila Patten, as well as the Special Representative of the Secretary General for Children and Armed Conflict and Under Secretary General, my friend, allow me, Ms. Virginia Gamba, for co-hosting this event with the Permanent Mission of Argentina. It is an honor, a true honor, and a privilege to share with you the 10th commemoration of the International Day of the Elimination of Sexual Violence in Conflict. And it's not the 10th anniversary, it's not an arithmetic matter, it's a substantive matter. Each and every day of these 10 years has been important, so it's really an honor and a pleasure to be here. I'm not a mathematician by training, I'm a diplomat, so I give particular importance to each and every day. Since 2015, this International Day is commemorated every year to mark the date of the unanimous adoption of the first Security Council resolution that recognized conflict-related sexual violence as a tactic of war and a threat to international peace and security in 2008. The purpose of this event is to stand in solidarity with victims and survivors of sexual violence in conflicts and those supporting them. This year, we are focusing on the attacks against healthcare facilities in conflict-affected areas and its impacts. While the world is facing the highest number of conflicts since World War II, and it's a shame, it's a tragedy, the attacks against healthcare facilities, while sexual violence in conflict areas exacerbates, constitute a complex challenge to guarantee the fundamental right to health and, particularly, to provide the life-saving assistance that victims deserve in such situations. Conflict-related sexual violence is an extremely devastating form of violence with lasting and harmful effects on victims, and sadly continues to be used as a tactic of war, torture, and terrorism. In that context, the attacks against healthcare facilities deepen the tragedy and the consequence of this type of violence and impede that hospital could be used for refuge, care, and support. It is imperative to address this issue with seriousness and responsibility, since the right to health shouldn't be vulnerated under no reason. But if we think that victims of sexual violence are unable to be assisted properly after being attacked, it becomes even worse. In this sense, we must claim for the respect of humanitarian law, as it clearly stipulates that hospitals are protected from attacks and should benefit from the humanitarian principles of distinctions and proportionality. The international community should use all the tools at its disposal to ensure the protection from attacks of health facilities, as they play a vital role for survivors of sexual violence, enabling them to benefit from a protective environment that is absolutely necessary to heal and rebuild their lives. As it was previously mentioned, despite the efforts made by the United Nations to maintain international peace and security, the world is facing the highest number of conflicts since World War II. All the regions are affected, and the end of those conflicts does not seem to be proximate. In that context, the United Nations as an organization, and each of us as its member state, we must work hard to keep the maintenance of peace and security as the primary goal, as our primary goal. However, being aware that conflicts are happening and the security and human rights of people are disregarded worldwide, we must raise our voices to claim for the respect of humanitarian law and plead for the protection of human rights, one of which is the right to health. In this context, the initial words of the Charter of the United Nations still echo in the walls of the organizations, although sometimes it seems that they do not penetrate our memory. And the initial words are very wise. We, the people of the United Nations, determined to have succeeding generations from the scourge of war, which twice in our lifetime has brought untold sorrow to mankind. These words are everywhere, but it seems that we don't listen to them that often. So I think that this is a proper moment and a proper time to remember those words. The founding father of the Argentine Constitution, almost 100 years ago, Juan Bautista Alberdi, said, "The expression just war involves a wild contradiction. It is the same as saying just crime, holy crime, legal crime. There can be no just war, because there is no judicious war. War is a temporary loss of judgment. At least it is a fact that in the state of war, men do nothing that is not madness, nothing that is not bad, ugly, unworthy of a good man." In such a context, the preservation of human right dignity should be a priority. The elimination of sexual violence should be the primary goal, but the right to health of victims and survival should be preserved as well. I thank you, all of you, for joining us and attending this event with us. I am sure that this morning we'll have a time of deep reflection that will urge us to contribute in different manners to raise the awareness of the need to stop attacks against hospitals and healthcare facilities in general, since victims, and in particular victims of sexual violence, depend on them for their survival and recovery. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Excellency. I will now hand the floor over to Special Representative of the Secretary General on Sexual Violence and Conflict, Under Secretary General Pramila Patten. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Excellency Mr. Lagorio, Permanent Representative of Argentina to the United Nations, Under Secretary General Virginia Gamba, Under Secretary General and Executive Director of UNFPA, Mrs. Canham, distinguished participants, ladies and gentlemen. A warm welcome to the 10th commemoration of the International Day on the Elimination of Sexual Violence in Conflict. Every year since 2015, we have marked this occasion through expressions of solidarity with survivors and those working to support them on the front lines, often at great personal risk. Yet, despite increased international awareness, the global trend lines continue to worsen. Sexual violence continues to be used as a tactic of war, torture, terrorism, and political repression amid deepening security crises, with civilians, particularly displaced, refugee and migrant women and girls, targeted with rape, gang rape, and abductions by state and non-state armed groups. The annual report of the Secretary General covering the year 2023 recorded 3,688 UN-verified cases of conflict-related sexual violence, reflecting a dramatic increase of 50% as compared with 2022. Every year, we note that conflict-related sexual violence is chronically underreported, and that most cases never reach a clinic, let alone a courtroom. This is directly linked with the targeting of healthcare providers who document cases at point of service delivery, often to silence and intimidate them, to destroy their information before it can become evidence, and to create a hostile environment that deters future reporting and response. In war-torn countries and regions, the dearth of data is directly linked to the paucity of service provision. Sexual violence has profound adverse effects on women's physical, sexual, reproductive, and mental health. Wars means that services are least available just when survivors of sexual and other forms of violence need them most. We are witnessing so-called surgical strikes on surgical wards, the bombing of maternity clinics and hospitals, essential medical supplies being looted, and healthcare facilities being forced to close their doors and relocate to areas remote from the population in desperate need. Unprecedented numbers of frontline service providers are risking and tragically losing their lives in an attempt to carry out their essential humanitarian work. Recent annual reports to the Security Council compiled by my office have highlighted attacks on healthcare centers and constraints on humanitarian access in contexts like Ethiopia, Haiti, Mali, Myanmar, the State of Palestine, the Sudan, and Ukraine, as well as rising reprisals in the form of harassment, threats, and targeted violence against healthcare workers. In the Sudan, shelling and aerial bombardments have decimated civilian infrastructure, including healthcare facilities. In Ukraine, over 1,000 attacks on healthcare have been registered by the United Nations since Russia's full-scale military invasion. According to the World Health Organization, there were 1,510 attacks on healthcare facilities in areas affected by armed conflicts in 2023. Attacks that deprive civilians of urgently needed care, endanger healthcare providers, and undermine health systems. The far-reaching impacts of attacks on healthcare are as disturbing as their frequency. In Sudan, while reports of sexual violence continue to emerge from both the capital and Darfur, 67% of health facilities in areas affected by the fighting that erupted in April 2023 have closed. In Haiti, an alarming 6 out of 10 hospitals are barely operational due to recent escalating violence in Port-au-Prince. Survivors of sexual violence need unimpeded and timely access to comprehensive services. In addition to physical injury, women and girls who are raped may be at risk of unwanted pregnancy or sexually transmitted infection, including HIV. If provided in time, emergency contraception can prevent an unwanted pregnancy, and post-exposure prophylaxis can prevent the transmission of HIV and other sexually transmitted diseases. Victims of rape who have become HIV positive may need antiretroviral treatment and/or prophylaxis for prevention of mother-to-child transmission. The consequences are also dire for survivors who become pregnant as a result of rape. Women who are raped and impregnated in situations of armed conflict risk resorting to unsafe methods of abortion and face increased risk and rates of maternal and infant mortality. In Kyiv, I heard the testimony of a woman who was raped by Russian forces and had to wait for 2 months for their departure to find a gynecologist who could treat her. In the meantime, she had developed severe medical complications. Her story is one of many which show that safe and timely access to healthcare is of paramount importance for survivors. Ladies and gentlemen, the military use of medical facilities and attacks on hospitals can pose grave, life-threatening dangers to persons who are pregnant or nursing, expectant mothers, and newborn babies, as we have witnessed in Gaza and Sudan over the past year. Such attacks are unacceptable violations of international humanitarian and human rights law. The right to seek medical assistance, especially in times of crisis, should never be denied. States have a positive obligation under IHL to ensure the special protection of medical establishments, personnel, and supplies, and to permit unhindered relief actions. These provisions accord preferential treatment to pregnant women and nursing mothers on account of their specific needs. Gynecological and obstetric assistance should always be considered an essential life-saving service in the context of humanitarian relief, especially as traditional information and referral networks often break down in times of war. The world cannot stand silent while hospitals, which should be safe havens, are transformed into scenes of death, devastation, and despair. We must ensure their effective protection and, failing that, effective prosecution for parties in breach of humanitarian norms. Ensuring the inviolability of healthcare facilities, even in the midst of war, is paramount for the protection of the basic human rights of survivors of sexual violence. Horrific attacks are forcing thousands of survivors to forego accessing health services, forcing women to give birth in bomb shelters with power outages, leaving premature and unwell infants with other incubators needed to sustain life. The psychological effects on those too terrified and traumatized to seek assistance and on health workers unable to provide care in safe environments are significant and will last long after the guns fall silent. Today, on the International Day for the Elimination of Sexual Violence in Conflict, we welcome the adoption of Security Council Resolution 2736 last week, which demands that all parties to the conflict in Sudan comply with their obligations under international law and recalls that civilian facilities, including hospitals and clinics, must be respected and protected. I call on all member states and partners to continually advocate for safe access for the delivery of survivor-centered healthcare services in line with the promise of Security Council Resolution 2467 of 2019. This is critical to putting survivors at the heart of the collective humanitarian response. It is imperative that survivors of sexual violence have unhindered, immediate and safe access to medical assistance, and that humanitarian actors have the resources, access, and conditions necessary to provide them with care. It is our collective responsibility, ladies and gentlemen, to ensure that healthcare facilities are never targeted by any party to armed conflict, and that they can provide a space of safety and healing where survivors can find solace to rebuild their lives with dignity and respect. Let us stand in solidarity with the survivors and service providers on the front lines who are so often underfunded, under fire, and overwhelmed. Healthcare continues to be among the first and worst casualties of war. We must strive for full compliance with international norms which afford healthcare structures and personnel special protection, while always remembering that no amount of assistance or protection is a substitute for peace. Let us continue working on this day and every day to silence the guns, amplify the voices of survivors, and champion their rights, not merely to survive, but to thrive in conditions of healing and hope. Thank you.
Thank you for those sobering words, Special Representative Patton, and for your call to action. I will now hand the floor over to the co-host of this event, Special Representative of the Secretary General for Children in Armed Conflict, Under Secretary General Virginia Gamba.
Thank you. Your Excellency Ricardo Lagorio, Permanent Representative of Argentina to the UN. Your Excellency Special Representative of Sexual Violence in Conflict, USG Pramila Patton, USG and the ED, of UNFPA, Natalia Canem, ladies and gentlemen. It is a pleasure to be with you on the 10th anniversary commemoration of the International Day for the Elimination of Sexual Violence in Conflict. Every year, this day is an important reminder of our collective responsibility to address and prevent conflict-related sexual violence, including against children. In our fight against this crime, it is crucial to acknowledge the unique vulnerabilities faced by women and girls. Such vulnerabilities are exacerbated when armed forces and armed groups attack civilian infrastructure, and particularly when they target healthcare facilities, personnel, and patients. The Children in Armed Conflict mandate monitors and reports on the 6 grave violations against children in armed conflict. The CAC mandate plays a critical role in reporting on sexual violence against children. The most recent report of the Secretary General on Children in Armed Conflict, published last week, highlights that in 2023, more than 32,000 grave violations affecting more than 22,500 children were verified in the 25 countries and 1 regional situation on the CAC agenda. This includes rape and other forms of sexual violence against children, as well as attacks against health infrastructures and care, which are at the heart of today's discussion. Grave violations have devastating consequences for children, leaving them traumatized, maimed, and sometimes killed or separated from their families. Safe places are destroyed and disrupted. Access to health care increases the risk of illness or death for already vulnerable children. But more broadly, grave violations jeopardize prospects of gender equality, peace, and sustainable development. It is our collective responsibility to put an end to and prevent such suffering. Regardless of their gender, children living in conflict-affected areas are at high risk of sexual violence. Sexual violence continues to be used as a tactic of war, as we heard. Children are raped, gang-raped, forcibly married, and sexually enslaved. Alarmingly, this year's annual report documented a 25% increase in sexual violence against children in 2023. Close to 1,500 children in conflict-affected areas have been verified as being raped or subject to sexual violence, with the highest numbers of survivors in the Central African Republic, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, Nigeria, Somalia, and the Sudan. While 90% of sexual violence was perpetrated against girls, the number of boy victims of rape and other forms of sexual violence increased by 25% as well in 2023. However, this number is only the tip of the iceberg, as this crime remains vastly underreported and for all survivors, boys and girls, because of the risk of reprisals and stigma, harmful gender norms, impunity, and the lack of support for survivors, including safe reporting channels, health and medical care, as well as psychosocial support. In 2023, more than 700 hospitals were attacked, verified by the United Nations Monitoring and Reporting Mechanism, with the highest numbers in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, Israel, and the occupied Palestinian territory, Myanmar, Sudan, and Ukraine. Attacks against healthcare disrupt fundamental services, depriving children from life-saving treatment. Vulnerable groups such as children and survivors of conflict-related sexual violence are often particularly affected, as they require sexual and reproductive health services, as we heard, or while they seek refuge in hospitals, hoping for safety and care, as happens in Gaza, for example. For 2023 in Sudan, with 70 to 80% of health facilities in conflict-affected areas being either inaccessible or not operational, it is likely that reports of sexual violence have decreased, as survivors have fewer opportunities to seek support. As a result of the conflict, our colleagues on the ground estimate that around 3.3 million individuals, nearly half of whom were children, did not have access to essential medical care. Although not grave violations, my office also records and verifies cases of military use of schools and hospitals. Such violations jeopardize the civilian nature of healthcare facilities and expose patients and medical personnel to heightened risks of attacks and further violence, including grave violations. International humanitarian law and international human rights law are very clear. Hospitals and medical personnel benefit from a special protection and should not be attacked. In 2016, in its Resolution 2286, the United Nations Security Council strongly condemned acts of violence, attacks, and threats against the wounded and sick, medical personnel, and hospitals. The Security Council also deplored the long-term consequences of such attacks for the civilian population and the healthcare systems. and it demanded all parties to conflict to fully comply with their obligations under international law. Hospitals must remain safety zones protected from the effects of war to ensure that the basic rights to life and health are respected. We cannot fail to guarantee the safety of those who protect and other victims of armed conflict. Moreover, in 2023, the United Nations verified more than 5,200 cases of denial of humanitarian access. By denying access to humanitarian convoys, by looting humanitarian aid, and by killing humanitarian workers, parties to conflict prevent children and survivors of sexual violence to access critical, life-saving humanitarian relief. Administrative impediments may also delay the evacuation of wounded children in desperate need of medical treatment. Here again, international humanitarian law is very clear. Parties to conflict must allow and facilitate rapid and unimpeded passage of humanitarian relief for civilians in need. The United Nations Security Council Resolution 2286 called on all parties to armed conflicts to facilitate safe and unimpeded passage for medical personnel and humanitarian personnel. Across conflicts, explosive weapons are increasingly used and result in grave violations against children. As these types of weapons have become more available and affordable, they are frequently used to attack hospitals and humanitarian workers, destroy critical civilian infrastructure, and disrupt the delivery of life-saving aid to vulnerable populations such as children and victims of sexual violence. Belligerents also use civilian infrastructure such as hospitals or the vicinity of hospitals to store explosive weapons, thus disrupting the safe delivery of healthcare to those in need. Excellencies, in light of this present situation, allow me to present you with 4 key areas to prioritize. 1, I call on member states and the international community to support and fund gender-sensitive reintegration programs for children who are victims of grave violations, including for victims of sexual violence. In 2023, more than 10,600 children formerly associated with armed forces or groups received protection or reintegration support. In Mozambique, for instance, I welcome the government's reintegration program for children in Cabo Delgado, including community sensitization to end cultural stigma against girls who were victims of sexual violence. Second, I encourage member states to endorse the political declaration on strengthening the protection of civilians from the humanitarian consequences arising from the use of explosive weapons in populated areas. It is also paramount to undertake explosive ordnance clearance, risk reduction, risk education, and victim assistance, and for member states to provide financial means to support this endeavor. 3, engagement with parties to conflict must continue. Powerful tools of the CAC mandate, such as action plans and prevention strategies, are key to putting an end to violations against children. Since the inception of the CAC mandate, the United Nations has signed more than 40 action plans under which parties to conflict commit to end grave violations against children, including sexual violence, attacks on schools and hospitals, and denial of humanitarian access. Lastly, accountability for sexual violence and attacks against healthcare must be a priority, as in most cases, perpetrators continue to walk freely and remain in positions of power. Our colleagues on the ground are also supporting governments in strengthening justice efforts with a survivor-centered and intersectional approach. For example, in Colombia, the Special Jurisdiction for Peace has recently opened case number 11, which focuses on sexual violence and gender-based crimes committed in the context of the conflict. Broader transitional justice mechanisms play an important role in recognizing children's suffering and in overcoming stigmatization imposed by their own communities, especially for sexual violence. By taking action to facilitate children's access to justice, we are contributing to preventing conflicts from occurring and reoccurring. Thank you.
Thank you, Special Representative Gamba, for reminding us of the devastation that children face in these environments, and also for outlining the preventative steps that we must take. Thank you so much. I'm now pleased to hand the floor over to Undersecretary General and Executive Director of UNFPA, the UN Population Fund, Dr. Natalia Kanem, on behalf of the UN Action Network. Thank you, Dr. Kanem.
Thank you so much, Excellencies, distinguished guests, dear colleagues, dear friends. I greet you in peace. Peace is the fervent wish of women and girls everywhere in the world. Calls to stop the bombs echo around the world today, yet peace is only possible when we end the scourge of conflict-related sexual violence. Imagine a woman in a war zone. She is traumatized, she's dehydrated, she's malnourished after being driven from her home, forced to flee her community, in constant fear of the horror of sexual violence, to get to food and water for her children, to use the sanitary facilities. She wonders, how am I going to traverse this terrain safely? Every single day, day in and day out, UNFPA helps to heal women who are haunted by unspeakable acts of sexual violence. Women like Aisha from Sudan, that's been on my mind, who tells us that since an armed militia took over her neighborhood, she was only able to leave the house for essential supplies and for food. And at first, it seemed okay. The soldiers were there, they didn't harass, they didn't harm her. But then one day, 2 men broke into her room wearing uniforms, told her not to scream. One held a gun, and she was raped by the other. When she finally escaped and went to a neighbor's house, she felt too ashamed to tell. She felt too ashamed to tell what had happened. Women rarely instigate wars, yet certainly they suffer most from war and conflict. And women's bodies, indeed, as the special representative indicated, have become battlegrounds when sexual violence is deliberately used during war and conflict to terrorize communities. With cases of conflict-related sexual violence spiraling 50% year-on-year, 2022 to 2023. Partly it's better documentation, but partly it's more horror. With women and girls assaulted, raped, forced into marriage, into sexual slavery. These are wounds that last a lifetime. And our social workers, our midwives, our community health workers are treating post-traumatic stress, sexually transmitted infections, including HIV. The social stigma and the isolation that both victims, the one on the video and the one I mentioned, alluded to. And then, of course, the physical injury, the unwanted pregnancies, but the profound mental health consequences last a lifetime, and this cannot be overstated. And most cases of sexual violence are perpetrated against women and now children, girls, a third. Although, of course, men, boys, people of diverse sexual orientation can also be victimized. But it's when health facilities collapse that they have nowhere to turn. In Gaza, in Ukraine, in Sudan, and so many other conflict zones, attacks on healthcare facilities and now on healthcare workers are decimating the few support structures in place to assist survivors and to help others to heal. As Gaza's health infrastructure now lies in ruins and women and girls are crowded into shelters, there we have a complete protection vacuum because of the lack of access. In Syria, there have been 600 attacks on medical facilities documented by Physicians for Human Rights, and I'm sure that their director, Payal Shah, will speak more to this. So you have a situation where bombings are wiping out so many healthcare facilities that survivors are now trekking. They're embarking on these long journeys to be able to seek medical help. And delayed medical attention to survivors of sexual violence only increases that risk of physical and mental health complications, prolongs their suffering. So let us be clear once again, because Virginia has already stated this very clearly. Sexual violence and conflict is a war crime. It is a crime that silences the voices that are pleading for peace. And that silence only deepens when those who speak go unheard, and then those who perpetrate these unspeakable acts go unpunished. And as a Rohingya woman told me, and it haunts me to this day, she looked at me and she said, "Doctor, it's the wound that you don't see. That's the wound that hurts the most." Together, I believe that we can break the silence. We can put some urgency to the task of ending this stain on our common humanity, because for as long as sexual violence persists, every survivor deserves protection. They deserve quality care, and they deserve rapid access to justice. UNFPA's leadership role in coordinating gender-based violence and risk mitigation, because we're paying more attention to prevention, to alerting rights holders of their rights in advance. These efforts in conflict settings meant that last year, 2023, we provided safety from gender-based violence for over 5.9 million people in 50 countries affected by crises. And the safe space methodology offers women and girls some emotional and physical refuge, but obviously that's not enough. The needs are staggering, and more resources are urgently needed to support our life-saving work across the humanitarian sector. So let me close with 3 pleas, and these are pleas with urgent underlined. Close the funding gap. This is so important because it prevents us from delivering at greater scale. And typically, less than 15% of the funds needed for essential prevention and protection services are available. Only 15% of what's needed is made available to respond to gender-based violence and crises. Second, let us pledge that health facilities will never be a target, in keeping with international law and international humanitarian law. Even during times of conflict, women and girls must be assured health and social protection services, and survivors of sexual violence need both medical and psychological support as a priority. UNFPA has joined the special representative in the insistence that the humanitarian system be revised to back up that statement, and we have taken measured steps in that direction. And third, and of course most important above all, listen to women. They are the frontline responders. They are the guardians of the family. They know what works in their own communities. And they must be assured representation in peace processes and in the political process. Their leadership should steer the decision-making. And that's how we will, once and for all, put an end to gender-based violence, to sexual violence as a weapon of war, and conquer this issue of impunity for perpetrators. No more unthinkable horrors. Today, being celebrated in the USA as Juneteenth, which marks the end of the era of enslavement, I have a final quote from Zora Neale Hurston, who said, "The present was an egg laid by the past that had the future inside its shell." The future that I want us to break out of that shell, the future is one that's free of sexual violence. It's a future that is only possible when we act in the present. So let us heed the voices of women and girls, silence the guns and not the survivors, and protect health workers in conflict zones to hasten the peace so women and girls can heal. Thank you.
Thank you, Executive Director Kanem, for this critical call to action and also for retelling the story of Aisha. Thank you so much. We will now have a video statement from the Right Honorable Michaëlle Jean, the 27th Governor. She's Governor General of Canada from 2005 to 2010. She was UNESCO Special Envoy for Haiti from 2010 to 2014, and third Secretary General of La Francophonie from 2014 to 2018. She was nominated and assumed the role of Global Champion in the fight against conflict-related sexual violence in May 2023. Please, I understand that our challenge has also been because we haven't used our earphones, so please take them up and use them to listen to the video. Thank you so much.
Dear friends, my name is Michaëlle Jean, former Governor General and Commander-in-Chief of Canada. I'm proud to serve as global champion in the fight against conflict-related sexual violence. History to this day is replete with examples of how abduction and sexual assault are used to terrorize entire communities as expressions of hatred, domination, and extreme degradation. Such massive violence against women and girls, and a proportion of men and boys, is a cruel and merciless weapon of mass destruction to annihilate not only individual victims, but entire groups, peoples, and nations. As my dear friend Pramila Patten stated, sexual violence is an invisible, cheap, and effective weapon of war. This year's theme on International Day for the Elimination of Sexual Violence in Conflict and its focus on how attacks against healthcare impact survivors of conflict-related sexual violence draws critical attention to assaults on medical facilities and how they exacerbate the suffering of survivors. It is clearly the case in Haiti, my native land, currently in the throes of horrible gang violence with mass suffering beyond words, especially in and around the capital city of Port-au-Prince, where all live in fear. 80% of neighborhoods are under siege from over 100 criminal organizations who are fighting each other. And clearly the use of rape is a pervasive tactic among those gangs. The crisis has reached catastrophic levels. Just in the first 3 months of this year, there have been 1,793 reported incidents of gender-based violence, with a staggering 75% involving sexual violence. Of course, the actual scale of the problem is an order of magnitude greater, because most women and girls are scared to report. There is a prevailing insecurity, the stigma, and the fear of reprisals. The situation is further aggravated by relentless attacks on healthcare facilities. With only 20% of hospitals, dispensaries, and clinics functioning normally, access to healthcare, to sexual and reproductive health, and to gender-based violence services in the capital is close to impossible. Let me quote a very close friend of mine, an obstetrician gynecologist who still lives and works in Haiti. The health sector, she says, is not on life support. It is on death row, nearing the point of being totally dismantled by gang violence. A death sentence to hundreds of thousands of Haitians. Hospitals that remain operational face severe shortages of medical supplies and staff who fear for their safety. This leaves the majority of sexual violence survivors without care. What a disaster. Such terrible perils when men comfort their hopelessness with weapons and sexual offense. With the power to kill comes the illusion of omnipotence. The resistance and courage of survivors demand our full support and solidarity. They are inspiration to all of us. that we must urgently dismantle the structures that enable such atrocities. So your commitment is hope in action. On this day, let us reaffirm our fierce dedication to ending this abhorrent violence and to building a future of dignity and peace for all. As we say in Haitian Creole, merci en pile. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I'm now pleased to introduce Ms. Payal Shah, Director of the Program on Sexual Violence in Conflict Zones at Physicians for Human Rights. Among other things, Ms. Shah's work bolsters the ability of doctors, nurses, police officers, lawyers, and judges inter alia to support survivors of sexual violence and to collect, document, and preserve forensic evidence related to these crimes. Thank you.
Distinguished hosts, esteemed panelists and guests, thank you for bringing us together on this important day. For survivors of conflict-related sexual violence, physicians are often crucial first responders and the gateway to both treatment and justice for survivors. For over a decade, my organization, Physicians for Human Rights, has worked to build the capacity of healthcare workers to provide trauma-informed and survivor-centered care for conflict-related sexual violence. Around the world, we have partnered with extraordinary physicians whose documentation has been integral to supporting survivors in accessing justice and accountability. However, despite the critical role of healthcare workers in conflict, attacks on health continue to occur with impunity globally. The prohibition on attacks on health is amongst the oldest legal norms in conflict. Yet these crimes are woefully under-prosecuted, with not a single successful international prosecution to date. The gendered impacts of attacks on health are often overlooked, but cannot be overstated. Attacks on health compound the harm of sexual violence by creating barriers to essential health care, hindering forensic documentation of sexual violence, and limiting pathways to reporting and wraparound services. Further, attacks on health constitute another form of gender-based violence, that is, reproductive violence, where they destroy the health services survivors need to preserve their reproductive autonomy. Over the past several years, PHR has documented the scope and nature of harm these intersecting violations can cause. For example, in Tigray, Ethiopia, where PHR has partnered with healthcare workers to document CRSV, service providers have emphasized the profound links between gender-based violence and attacks on health. Experts estimate that up to 50% of women in Tigray experienced gender-based violence during the conflict, and over 90% of healthcare facilities were rendered non-functional due to the attacks on the healthcare system. In 2023, PHR and our partner, OJA, conducted a review of 304 medical records of conflict-related sexual violence that showed that the survivors faced brutal forms of violence that particularly endangered their reproductive organs. Survivors had acute resulting health needs, including fistulas, incontinence, prolapse, bleeding, and severe mental health trauma. Yet, most survivors faced inordinate delays in accessing care, with median of 5 months passing from the violation to seeking medical attention. Barriers to healthcare meant survivors could not access time-sensitive care to prevent sexual violence from resulting in pregnancy or sexually transmitted infections, including HIV, in violation of their rights to reproductive autonomy and health. Further, the delays also raised concerns that survivors were being deterred from timely reporting of sexual violence by the attacks, which can limit accountability and justice. What we documented in Ethiopia is similar to what we've seen in other conflict settings. In northwest Syria, for example, a 2023 study by PHR and partners documented the cumulative impacts of attacks on health on sexual and reproductive health care. The report found marked declines in health-seeking behavior due to fear of attacks, including women foregoing prenatal care altogether or opting for invasive cesarean sections instead of vaginal births to be able to avoid long, unplanned stays in hospitals. Similarly, in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, we've seen how healthcare workers themselves, including Nobel Peace Prize winner Dr. Denis Mukwege, were attacked because of their crucial role in documenting conflict-related sexual violence and in the pursuit of accountability. Attacks on health themselves are attacks on the documentation systems for both sexual and reproductive violence. Understanding the linkages between attacks on health and conflict-related sexual violence is important to fully understand the extent of the harm caused by sexual violence, to rebuild health systems to meet survivors' needs post-conflict, and also to pursue full accountability. All too often, CRSV and attacks on health are seen as distinct, but it is increasingly clear that such acts can form part of a broader pattern of attacks aimed at diminishing bodily autonomy, including sexual and reproductive autonomy. As reports from Ukraine and Gaza emerge, for example, of reproductive health facilities specifically, including maternity hospitals and IVF clinics being targeted, it is important to investigate whether and how such acts link to broader patterns of conflict-related gender-based violence. There are several key actions that the UN and states parties can take to end impunity for these cascading violations. First, as others have indicated, accountability for these violations must be prioritized, including at the ICC and through universal jurisdiction cases. States must also ensure an independent, impartial international investigation of the gendered impacts of attacks on health are undertaken, and remedy situations like that of Ethiopia, where the fact-finding efforts have lapsed due to political pressure despite evidence of ongoing violations. Second, it is critical to ensure that survivors' needs are met in humanitarian response and in post-conflict efforts. And finally, there is an urgent need to strengthen the international legal framework to more explicitly condemn the gendered impacts of attacks on health. One direct measure would be for states to support adoption of the Crimes Against Humanity Treaty and take up civil society recommendations to strengthen the provisions on reproductive violence within the current draft. Thank you again for the opportunity to raise these important issues.
Thank you, Ms. Shah. I'm also very pleased to introduce Ms. Kavya Ashoka, Executive Director of the NGO Working Group on Women, Peace and Security. The NGO Working Group on Women, Peace and Security is an independent advocacy coalition of 18 civil society organizations that advocates for women's rights and the full, equal, and meaningful participation of women in all aspects of international peace and security. Welcome.
Thank you so much to our hosts for this opportunity to address you today on behalf of the NGO Working Group on this important topic of attacks against health care in conflict-affected areas. I would like to start with the impact of the war on Gaza on women's rights. As the Independent International Commission of Inquiry recently reported, the 7th October attacks by Hamas and Palestinian armed groups included horrific acts of sexual and gender-based violence against Israeli women, and in the occupied Palestinian territory, Israeli forces have systematically targeted and subjected Palestinian men and women to sexual and gender-based violence, including forced nudity, sexualized torture, and sexual humiliation and harassment. As the Women, Peace and Security agenda makes clear, we must be unequivocal about the unacceptability of sexual violence in armed conflict against anyone, anywhere. It is just as critical that we address the full range of gender-based harms in this conflict and are equally clear that such violations are also unacceptable. The war on Gaza, as the UN Women described just this month, is also a war on women. Of the more than 37,000 Palestinian lives that this brutal conflict has taken, more than 10,000 are women, of whom an estimated 6,000 are mothers. More than 1 million women and girls in Gaza are facing an unprecedented assault on their rights as a result of not only the current conflict, but over half a century of occupation. Horrific violence, constant bombardment, mass displacement, starvation and looming famine, lack of water and sanitation, and no functional medical system. Since 7th October, the World Health Organization has confirmed 935 attacks on healthcare facilities and workers in the occupied Palestinian territory, leaving 84% of healthcare facilities damaged or destroyed. In late May, the last maternity hospital in Rafah was forced to close, leaving an estimated 10,000 pregnant women without the care they need. The relentless bombardment of hospitals, combined with the Israeli government's restrictions on fuel, water, and aid, has led to the collapse of the healthcare system. Access to essential services and resources, including sexual and reproductive health services, is limited or non-existent. And so, women across Gaza are giving birth without any pain relief, in plastic tents, in rubble, in the streets, in circumstances that can only be described as reproductive violence. Of the estimated 700,000 women and girls in Gaza who are of menstruating age, some are having to resort to cutting up scraps of refugee tents in place of sanitary products. In the crisis in Sudan, which has already had devastating consequences for women, the UN has reported widespread, ethnically motivated, and systematic conflict-related sexual violence. Without violations of the Security Council's arms embargo, we simply would not be seeing these levels of sexual violence. Sudanese women have described to the Security Council in gruesome detail the rape of girls as young as 12, and how families must make unfathomable choices between getting them the medical care they need or feeding their siblings. Attacks on medical facilities, restrictions on communications, and deliberate obstruction of humanitarian aid by the warring parties are making it even harder for survivors to access life-saving services, including sexual and reproductive health services. OCHA has reported that over 80% of hospitals in Sudan are no longer functional, and in El Fasher, where the civilian population is facing imminent famine and the risk of genocide, there is just one hospital left. In April, we heard that there are less than a dozen obstetricians and gynecologists left working in Khartoum. Just yesterday, the Security Council heard from another Sudanese woman, a humanitarian worker, about how women's organizations are on the front line of the response, despite daunting challenges to their operations, and how they simply cannot meet the scale of need without funding and support from the international community. In Afghanistan, the most serious women's rights crisis globally, the Taliban's now over 90 gender apartheid policies have ensured that the space for women and girls to make their own decisions and live their lives gets smaller every day. Since GBV services have been dismantled, male doctors are not allowed to see female patients, and women have been banned for working from NGOs and humanitarian providers, millions of Afghan women and girls are now unable to access necessary health care. The Taliban's policies are taking an unimaginable toll on the mental health of women and girls, evidenced by the fact that the majority of suicides in Afghanistan since the Taliban takeover are by women. Women who are so desperate under the oppressive conditions of Taliban rule that suicide is the only escape. While courageous Afghan women continue to protest these policies and demand equality, the UN and the international community have chosen to meet with the Taliban in Doha without Afghan women and girls, who continue to be excluded from discussions about their own lives. As we near 25 years of the Women, Peace and Security agenda, what I am describing should be unacceptable to all of you gathered here today. Attacks on civilians and civilian infrastructure, including hospitals, the targeting of women human rights defenders, restrictions on women aid workers, and impunity for violations of women's rights should be unacceptable. Negotiations, especially those led by the UN, without women at the table, should also be unacceptable. Most importantly, I urge you all to act on the fundamental premise of the Women, Peace and Security agenda, which is to stop war and militarized violence altogether, which is the only way to dismantle patriarchy, disarm misogyny, and protect women's rights. To do anything less is not only to fail the women of Gaza and Sudan and Afghanistan, but to fail women experiencing conflict everywhere. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Ashoka. We now have interventions from member states, and we will open with Myanmar, with the permanent representative of Myanmar to the United Nations.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Moderator. I thank the co-hosts for organizing this important event. I also thank the speakers for their insightful statements. Conflicts taking place around the world nowadays are imposing numerous unprecedented threats to international peace and security in multiple fronts. We are witnessing of alarmingly increased number of victims from healthcare and humanitarian personnel. Our theme today is a stark reminder that much more needs to be done for the elimination of sexual violence in conflict. We need action, we need effective action. Mr. Chair, as we look into the issue, the situation of my country, Myanmar, alongside other prominent conflicts, give us a clear picture on the degree of destruction caused by conflicts and SRSV. Since the illegal military coup in Myanmar in February 2021, the military junta has been continuously committing numerous atrocities, including CRSB, amounting to war crimes and crimes against humanity. On the healthcare front, the challenges persist. Nearly 1,200 attacks by the juntas on healthcare workers and facilities have taken place in the past 3 years. Many medical personnel have also been arbitrarily detained and arrested. More than 100 of healthcare workers have been killed and injured during conflicts. Furthermore, on a daily basis, the military juntas continue to attack healthcare facilities and impose blockade on medicines and other medical equipment in a targeted and systematic manner. In this regard, I wish to draw your attention on the following important points. Given the vicious nature of the military junta, all forms of violence, including sexual violence against innocent civilians, were increased further. Moreover, there is another alarming concerning that the girls would be recruited through the junta's forced conscription. Healthcare sector is facing daunting challenges. Many healthcare workers have been leaving the country due to the coup and the junta's atrocities. The National Unity Government, together with EROs and the people of Myanmar, have put our efforts to protect women and girls and prevent them from CRSB. However, more need to be done. In this regard, we need strong and effective support from the international community by taking a holistic approach to address the root causes of the crisis in Myanmar. In conclusion, Mr. Chair, we must make perpetrators accountable by ending their blanket impunity in order to address the situation in Myanmar. Cutting flow of arms and jet fuel and financial assistance to the military junta is crucial to meet our endeavors. Ending the military dictatorship and building a federal democratic union in Myanmar means bringing back peace and future to the people in Myanmar. It is our responsibility to bring violators of international law to justice. This will serve as the most suitable physical and mental remedy for victims who have suffered from conflict-related sexual violence in Myanmar. I thank you.
Thank you, Excellency. We will now hand the floor to the Permanent Representative of Timor-Leste. You have the floor.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And thank you also for the speakers for their very insightful presentations. Madam Chair, healthcare personnel have been challenged worldwide, and violent attacks on health and care facilities have continued to this date. As we have witnessed from various reports and the lenses of international media, numerous attacks on healthcare facilities and personnel have taken place in various regions, including the Middle East, Ukraine, South Sudan, Central Africa, Republic, and Asia. My country, Timor-Leste, had the same experience in the past as well. Indeed, the targeting of civilian infrastructure, including hospitals and healthcare and facilities, has been an explicit strategy of modern warfare. According to the World Health Organization, there were over 1,000 reported attacks on healthcare facilities and personnel in 2020 alone. These attacks result in damage to infrastructure, theft of medical supplies, and injury or death to healthcare workers and patients. In the Middle East, hospitals and healthcare facilities have been repeatedly targeted in Gaza and Syria. For example, in Gaza, concerns about disproportionate attacks on medical facilities, personnel, and transport are further destroying Gaza's healthcare system. Similarly, in Ukraine, Yemen, Sudan, Central African Republic, Syria, and Myanmar, as we have just heard, healthcare facilities have been attacked, leaving medical staffs and patients vulnerable. We have also heard reports that some of these health facilities been used to harbor terrorist groups and divert international medical aid, and this needs to be investigated further. Madam Chairman, international humanitarian law protects hospitals and other medical facilities during armed conflicts, including their staffs, patients, and transportation. This protection extends to both military and civilian patients who need medical attention and are not actively participating in hostilities. Parties to a conflict must take steps to protect medical units from attack, such as keeping them away from military objectives. According to Article 19 of Geneva Convention, relative to the protection of civilian persons in time of war, civilian hospitals are protected unless they are used to harm the enemy. In this case, protection can only be lifted after giving due warning and setting a reasonable time limit. The attacks on healthcare personnel and facilities in conflict-affected areas must be avoided, as they can lead to loss of life and health services, as well as long-term health issues due to disrupted systems, destroyed facilities, and loss of supplies. Moreover, these attacks are a grave violation of humanitarian law and human rights, international criminal law, and they put countless lives at risk. Madam Chair, the attacks on healthcare personnel and hospital facilities bring severe impacts on survivors of conflict-related sexual violence, as we've heard around this table. These individuals often require specialized medical care and psychological support, which is compromised when healthcare facilities are attacked. The lack of access to healthcare assistance can lead to long-term physical and mental health consequences, including HIV, unintended pregnancy, and PTSD. To avoid conflicting interests between healthcare workers and attackers, we need to make sure the parties in conflict should not use hospitals as a stronghold to harm their enemy. We need to also control and monitoring the armed groups to prevent attacks on healthcare facilities. Strict scrutiny of military actions to ensure they do not target healthcare facilities or personnel. Establishment of safe zones for healthcare facilities and personnel. Support humanitarian organizations providing medical care in conflict zones, and accountability for perpetrators of attack on health care facilities and personnel. Sexual violence as a weapon of war is a devastating and widespread human rights violence that affects millions of people around the world, particularly in conflict zones. It is often a deliberate tactic used to terrorize, humiliate, and destroy communities, and its impact can be long-lasting and debilitating. Madam Chair, to conclude, the international community must take action to protect healthcare in conflict-affected areas. This includes supporting humanitarian organizations, holding perpetrators accountable, and advocating for the respect of humanitarian law and human rights. We must ensure that survivors and conflict-related sexual violence receive the care they need and deserve. The attacks on healthcare in conflict-affected areas must be avoided. We must work towards creating a safer and more protective environment for healthcare workers and health facilities in all conflict zones. Thank you.
Thank you, Excellency. I now hand the floor to the permanent representative of Greece. Excellency, the floor is yours.
Yes, thank you so much, Madam Chairs, Excellencies, SRSGs, colleagues, dear friends. I'm very honored to be able to participate in today's panel discussion to commemorate the official observance of the International Day of the Elimination of Sexual Violence in Conflict, and I would like to particularly thank the co-organizers, SRSG for Sexual Violence in Conflict, Ms. Patton, SRSG for Children in Armed Conflict, Ms. Gamba, and the Permanent Mission of Argentina to the United Nations, His Excellency Ambassador Ricardo Lagorio. Greece recognizes the disproportionate impact of armed conflict and conflict-related gender-based and sexual violence on women and children, girls and boys. This disproportionate impact is further exacerbated by indiscriminate, appalling, non-justifiable by any means, and so totally unacceptable attacks on hospitals and healthcare services by the conflict parties. Hospitals are zones of peace and security in times of conflict, and therefore merit full protection as civilian objects under international humanitarian law. SRSG, Ms. Patton, you used in your intervention the expression surgical strikes. What an antithesis, what a tragic irony. This expression is being used to describe precision strikes on military targets alone in order to avoid civil casualties. And here, it's being used exactly for the opposite. Surgical strike to attack hospitals where surgeons try to do the work, the sacred work. It's totally unacceptable. I agree with you, and thank you for mentioning it. Close the parenthesis. This was not in my written remarks. Moreover, attacks on hospitals during conflict is one of the 6 grave violations affecting children the most in times of war because, first, they impede the survivors' access to comprehensive medical care and psychosocial support, including sexual and reproductive health. Secondly, they severely impact women and girls impregnated as a result of rape. And thirdly, they might result in the disruption or collapse of the local healthcare system. In this regard, we, UN member states, should adopt a survivor-centered approach to preventing and addressing conflict-related sexual violence that seeks to empower survivors by prioritizing the specific needs and considers intersecting inequalities based on sex, gender, age, sexual orientation, and gender identity, among other factors. At the same time, they should ensure that survivors' rights are fully respected and that the capacity to make informed decisions is promoted. Finally, strengthening accountability for the alleged perpetrators of these crimes by adopting appropriate judicial mechanisms and promoting transformative, gender-responsive reparations for the survivors is a sine qua non element for achieving long-lasting peace, sustainable development, and social justice. I thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador. Thank you, Excellency. We now turn to the Ambassador and Permanent Representative of Andorra. You have the floor. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, and dear colleagues. I will be very short because we want to take this opportunity just to express our support to this International Day and listen to the experience of the colleagues. And Andorra was very honored to join Argentina and other sponsors on the landmark resolution that we are celebrating, highlighting the need to join forces to eliminate sexual violence in conflict. We remember and honor victims and survivors of these heinous crimes. And Ambassador, thank you very much to you and your mission for raising the topic on attacks against healthcare services and setting up this robust and broad vision panel. Thanks also to all of you for shaping the mandates you are having and providing with verified information and coordination on the field. The figures are very precise when you provide them to us. Maybe they are the tip, for sure, they are the tip of iceberg. Yes, but each of them is a person. And your necessary endeavors, all these teams, in keeping us abreast and equipping us better to identify and prevent and address conflict related sexual and gender-based violence are crucial. And allow me to recognize Mrs. Patton, Mrs. Gamba's co-organizers, and Under Secretary Kanem, and all of the panelists and testimonies. And of course, as we indicated of other opportunities, raising awareness is crucial to prevent sexual violence in conflict. So we have many tools, many instruments, frameworks to the prevention of conflict-related sexual violence, just to mention one to be short. And of course, the most powerful tool is the international humanitarian law that prohibit sexual violence, and that must be respected. And furthermore, there is another important element that is the Rome Statute, that is a landmark international treaty that criminalizes and codifies different as war crimes and crimes against humanity. And when the use of every vulnerability is a tactic of war, but a weapon, the critical value of hospitals and care facilities, the pressure on health workers become easily targeted. The consequences on people and facilities span in a long term, as has been very well explained here, and that's why we have the law. And the extreme vulnerability of women, children as main victims of sexual violence in conflict is exacerbated when deprived of the right of health. So once again, to us, participation of women is indispensable in any phase of conflict for prevention and lasting peace, but also this participation must be part of any process in politics, ending impunity and also pledging in our international community to advocate for protecting health facilities could be helpful for this endeavor. I thank you very much for your presentation and for give me the floor at this moment. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Excellency. I now turn to Ambassador and Deputy Permanent Representative of Poland. You have the floor.
Excellencies, colleagues, let me start by thanking Argentina, SRSG Pramila Patten and SRSG Virginia Gamba and their teams for convening us today. As we observe this 10th International Day for the Elimination of Sexual Violence in Conflict, we are reminded of this urgent need for action to address the growing number of armed conflicts worldwide and their devastating impact on vulnerable populations. Poland is deeply concerned by the rise of conflict-related sexual violence, and a reality that in our neighborhood has been highlighted by the ongoing Russian war of aggression against Ukraine, but it's by far not the only case. Sexual violence is not only a brutal weapon of war, as it's been said already today, but it's also a profound violation of human rights that affects individuals and the entire communities alike, and we must place their protection at the forefront to our efforts. Poland is committed to ensuring accountability for perpetrators of conflict-related sexual violence, and we advocate for the practical implementation of international commitments, moving beyond political declarations to concrete actions to strengthen prevention efforts and combat impunity. Collecting evidence is crucial for the effective prosecution of these heinous acts. That's why Poland actively supports Ukraine in documenting cases of conflict-related sexual violence committed by Russia on Ukrainian territory. In response to the humanitarian crisis, Poland has provided refuge to one of the largest number of Ukrainian refugees, mostly women and their families. Our initiatives focus on ensuring access to essential services, including healthcare services and psychological assistance to all refugees, including survivors of sexual violence. We also conducted awareness-raising campaigns within our uniformed services to better address and support the needs of these survivors. Protection of victims and conflict-related sexual violence remains a priority, a key priority in Polish humanitarian aid and development assistance programs. And this commitment will be reflected in the new edition of the Polish National Action Plan on Women, Peace and Security agenda, currently being drafted. And further demonstrating our support to this agenda, Poland decided to contribute for the first time to the Women, Peace and Humanitarian Fund. And as we reflect on the critical role of the healthcare facilities play in supporting survivors, it is imperative that we work collectively to safeguard these institutions. Attacks on healthcare facilities deprive entire communities of essential services, compounding the suffering of survivors and undermining their right to health and safety. The international community must uphold the principles of international humanitarian law, ensuring the protection of healthcare workers and facilities, as well as other civilian infrastructures in conflict zones. Poland plays an active role in this regard, and together with partners has consistently brought this topic up during consecutive protection of civilians weeks in past years, and including this past May. Today, as we observe the 10th International Day for the Elimination of Sexual Violence in Conflict, we must renew our commitment to ending rape in war, advocating for justice, and providing comprehensive support to survivors. And you can count on us. Poland will continue to champion this effort. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador. We will give the floor to Malta, to the Deputy Permanent Representative of Malta. The floor is yours, Ambassador.
Thank you very much, and good morning to all. Thank you for Argentina for co-organizing this event, and together with SRSG's Patten and Gamba, and also, of course, all the distinguished panelists for all your insightful remarks. Very touching to hear about all the work you do, about how important, and reminds us how important this is today, particularly, but how we have to work every day against the elimination of sexual violence and conflict. In conflicts around the world, the relentless and targeted attacks against healthcare devastates communities and exacerbates human suffering. The proliferation of over 1 billion small arms and light weapons globally fuels these attacks and contributes directly to conflict-related sexual violence in the Democratic Republic of Congo, Haiti, Libya, Mali, Myanmar, the occupied Palestinian territory, Sudan, and South Sudan. In Sudan's Darfur region, which, as the Security Council only held a meeting yesterday, Widespread sexual violence combined with attacks on healthcare has left survivors without access to medical care, psychosocial support, and justice. In Syria, where systematic sexual violence is committed by various parties, the bombardment of hospitals and clinics deprives survivors of critical services, treatment, and counseling. In Gaza, the systematic destruction of hospitals and clinics deprives civilians of essential medical care, intentionally reducing hospitals to rubble, targeting ambulances, and killing and intimidating medical personnel. In Ukraine, attacks on healthcare have created service barriers for both male and female survivors of sexual violence. For survivors of sexual violence, this is a profound betrayal. In Yemen, the protracted conflict has crippled the healthcare system, leaving survivors with limited options for support. In the DRC, sexual violence is used as a tactic of war and terror, leaving survivors without access to care or justice. These strategic assaults cripple communities, sow fear, and exacerbate suffering. And as we have also been reminded today, without access to healthcare, survivors face increased risks of infections, long-term medical and mental health crises, with profound effects on families and communities. But beyond the physical trauma, the social stigma associated with CRSV often leads to community rejection and economic marginalization. Addressing this scourge requires a comprehensive, survivor-centered approach, prioritizing prevention, protection, access to services, and accountability. As chair of the Security Council Working Group of Children Armed Conflict and as coordinator of the Shared Commitment on Women, Peace and Security, Malta has made the protection of women and girls in conflicts and from SGBV a priority. We must ensure the implementation of international law protecting healthcare in conflicts. We must hold perpetrators accountable, and we must ensure the availability of medical services in the most challenging environments. Finally, we must curb military spending and halt arms exports to conflict zones. Malta was an early signatory of the Arms Trade Treaty, and we urge all remaining states to sign, ratify, and fully implement the ATT. Further, we call for the full implementation of UNSC resolutions 2286 and 2467, which condemn attacks on healthcare and demands compliance with international humanitarian law. And today shows that we must advocate for stronger protective measures for healthcare workers, increased funding for healthcare infrastructure in conflict zones, and gender-responsive and gender-sensitive humanitarian action. Together, we can forge a path towards where every survivor receives the care and support they heal the need not only to heal, but also to thrive. I thank you.
Thank you, Excellency. We now turn to Norway, to Ambassador and Deputy Permanent Representative of Norway. Excellency, the floor is yours.
Nancy, for moderating and for giving the floor, and not the least thanks to you, Ambassador Lagoria and Argentina, and together with Patton and your office and Gamba and your team in bringing us together at this moment to commemorate the International Day for the Elimination of Sexual Violence in Conflict. I would like to thank the briefers for oral compelling statements in today's session. And in particular, we value and appreciate the voice of one of the survivors. We meet today, literally, 16 years after the unanimous adoption by the UN Security Council of the Resolution 1820. Unfortunately, across conflicts, sexual violence remains an alarming concern and a tactic of war. Attacks on medical personnel and health facilities are unacceptable. They also directly impact the survivor of sexual violence access to sexual and reproductive health services. And as we have heard today, and as we know, they have long-term devastating impact on each society. So in this context, allow me to just highlight 3 points from our side. First, all parties to armed conflict must comply with their obligations under international law, including IHL and human rights. Women and girls, men and boys must be protected from sexual violence. Medical personnel and their clinics and ambulances must be protected from attacks. This responsibility lies clearly on the parties to the conflict. But we, as member states, can all contribute to prevention through our humanitarian diplomacy and by supporting IHL training of the parties. Accountability and ending impunity for violation of IHL are also important for, or in terms of prevention. And sexual violence as designation criteria in the UN sanction regimes remains an important instrument to be utilized. Second, sexual violence against children is one of the 6 grave violations, as we know, and so is also attacks against schools and hospitals. Girls are disproportionately affected by sexual violence, but boys are often at high risk of sexual violence too, especially in terms of detentions or when recruited by armed forces or armed groups. Child victims of armed conflict must be ensured physical and psychological recovery and social reintegration. Thirdly, the specific needs of children born of war should be openly recognized and addressed as a matter of priority. Children born of war are at a greater risk of experiencing stigma, discrimination, socio-economic deprivation, and developing mental disorders. They often face challenges with identity papers. Securing women's rights will often improve the protection also of the children. To conclude, combating sexual and gender-based violence remains a high priority for Norway. We will maintain a high level of support for prevention and follow-up of the survivors, both financially and politically. We will therefore continue to support a multi-partner trust fund for conflict-related sexual violence. And finally, a survivor-centered approach demands that survivors, in all their diversity, have the right to participate in defining their needs and priorities, which must guide the response. Women must be ensured full, equal, and meaningful participation in the response. And local, women-led organizations play a key role in this regard. I thank you.
Thank you, Excellency. I now hand the floor to France, to Minister Counselor, Head of the Legal and Human Rights Department in the French Mission. The floor is yours, Madame.
Merci beaucoup, chers collègues, and really thank to all the briefers. France thank Argentina for organizing and command the organization of this event, marking the International Day for the Elimination of Sexual Violence in Conflict. I think that my colleagues from Norway just said it, and I want to insist on how alarmed by the increase reported by the WHO over the past 5 years we are of the number of attacks on healthcare facilities in areas affected by armed conflict. Our previous colleagues and speakers quoted a lot of situations, whether we are talking about Middle East, whether we are talking DRC, Ukraine, Syria, Libya, Haiti. I think that it's a lot, knowing the situation around the world. Let me emphasize the situation in Sudan, where attacks on hospitals and threats against health workers have direct and traumatic impact and consequences for survivors of sexual violence, who are thus deprived of access to life-saving assistance, protection, reporting, and reintegration services. Partially or almost totally, destroyed health structures are more overwhelmed by the flux of internally displaced persons or refugees. It's a shame to have to say it in 2024, but we underline that committing sexual violence in conflict and deliberately targeting civilian or civilian infrastructure has such violate international humanitarian law and international human rights law and can amount to international crimes. We condemned all forms of sexual violence, notably the use of rape as a tactic of war. And I would like to emphasize 4 points here. The first one, all warring parties should ensure the protection of civilians and a full, safe, rapid, and unhampered humanitarian access. Protecting healthcare facilities in conflict zones is crucial, paramount for the exercise of the human rights of survivors of sexual violence. This is precisely what the International Humanitarian Conference for Sudan and neighboring countries held in Paris last April called for. Secondly, We must fight against the impunity of the perpetrator of sexual violence in conflict. As we celebrate the 50 years of existence of the mandate of the Special Representative for Sexual Violence in Conflict, we express our full support for the team of experts and for its held mandate and call for all member states of the United Nations to unconditionally support the mandate. We commend the organization of the first International Conference of Prosecutor and Accountability for Conflict-Related Sexual Violence held in The Hague last March. Thirdly, we must ensure access to essential health services, including sexual and reproductive health services, in line with the survivor-centered approach. In this regard, financial support to civil society organizations like the Global Survivors Fund is key. Fourthly and lastly, the Security Council must strengthen its use of sanctions against the perpetrator of sexual violence in line with the resolution it has adopted in the framework of the Women, Peace and Security Agenda. As a permanent member of the Security Council, you can count on France to really fulfill this commitment and engagement with all other members of the Security Council, and I thank you.
Thank you, Madam. I'll now turn to the legal advisor of the Permanent Mission of Israel. You have the floor.
Thank you. Distinguished colleagues, thank you for the opportunity to speak in this meaningful occasion, the International Day for the Elimination of Sexual Violence in Conflict. Sexual violence as a weapon of war is one of the most heinous crimes imaginable. Today, we give voice to those who cannot share their own horrific experiences. We condemn, in the strongest possible term, any use of rape, sexual assault, or other forms of sexual violence, including during armed conflict. On this day, we cannot fail to mention our own hostages, including women who for 9 long months have been held captive in Hamas dungeons and tunnels since October 7th massacre. Testimonies and witness reports from that day paint a nightmarish scenes across southern Israel. Patterns of rape, including gang rape, undressing and restraining of victims, naked bodies desecrated in the most abhorrent ways, and some victims sexually assaulted and then murdered in cold blood. I was sorry to hear very little emphasis, essentially next to nothing, on the grave sexual violence committed against Israeli women from October 7th onward in this room today. I will be their voice, since it appears they will not gain another one here today. Harrowing testimonies from those who returned from captivity reveal sexual violence they endured at the hands of their captors. As concluded in the report of the SRSG pattern, there is a clear and convincing information that some hostages have been subjected to various forms of conflict-related sexual violence. SRSG pattern and her team also found reasonable grounds to believe that such violence may still be ongoing against those who are still held in captivity. Our worst nightmares have become their reality. Our female hostages, while enduring unfathomable abuse in captivity, have also been deprived of medical care. Hospitals in Gaza have been turned into military bases with miles of tunnels dug beneath to shield Hamas operations. The deprivation of medical and humanitarian assistance to the hostages has mostly gone unaddressed by humanitarian actors, also in this room. We must all wonder why that is. Colleagues, on this day of solidarity, we renew our commitment to protect the vulnerable and to punish perpetrators. Colleagues, on this day of solidarity, we renew our commitment to protect the vulnerable and punish perpetrators of these horrific crimes. Sexual violence in armed conflict not only devastates individuals, but also fractures communities and societies, perpetuating cycles of violence and instability. We demand that all hostages, women, children, men, and elderly people are returned immediately without any conditions, and we urge you to do the same. They have been cruelly taken away from their families and suffered unimaginable trauma. Moreover, We call for preventing sexual violence in armed conflict by having open conversation and educating the young generations from the early age. Today's children are the adults and the leaders of tomorrow. And it is our responsibility to give them the knowledge and strength to put the end to this horrific practice once and for all. Thank you.
Thank you. We now hand the floor to the Deputy Permanent Representative of Lithuania. Ambassador, you have the floor.
The Office of the Special Representative of Secretary General on Sexual Violence in Conflict and the Office of the Special Representative of Secretary General for Children and Armed Conflicts for organizing this meeting today. We appreciate the valuable insights shared by the briefers. We convene today at a critical juncture. The international community is currently facing a significant rise in global instability, manifesting in various forms, from increased civil unrest to proliferating armed conflicts. These developments are not isolated events. They represent a complex, interconnected challenges that demand our collective attention and coordinated response. Lithuania condemns, in the strongest possible terms, Hamas' brutal and indiscriminate terrorist attacks across Israel on October 7, 2023. Recently published reports of the Secretary General on Children and Armed Conflicts notes that in 2023, the UN verified 388 attacks on schools and health facilities in Israel and the West Bank. The numbers are devastating. Russia's unprovoked war in Ukraine has unleashed horrific suffering on civilians and those captured by Russian forces. Women and girls become primary targets of sexual violence during the war or armed conflict. Additionally, there is evidence that Ukrainian prisoners of war being subjected to sexual violence during their internment, as documented in the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights report of March 2024. This included attempted rape, threats of rape and castration, beating or electric shocks to genitals, and repeated forced nudity. Secretary General's report on conflict-related sexual violence emphasizes that since the start of the full-scale invasion, the UN has registered over 1,000 attacks on healthcare. These blatant violations of IHL and international human rights law fundamentally undermine the core principles of human rights. Given the widespread evidence of Russian forces weaponizing conflict-related sexual violence, it is imperative to include all Russian parties in the Secretary General's report on CRSV annexes. These are the military as well as Federal Security Service and Federal Penitentiary Services units responsible for rape, the war crime and sexual violence. The anonymity and impunity of the perpetrators encourage a vicious circle of violence. Victims deserve justice and redress. The situation regarding attacks on healthcare facilities and personnel in other conflict-related areas are equally worrying. The destruction and disruption of healthcare facilities and attacks on healthcare personnel in conflict zones create a devastating ripple effect, severely limiting access to essential medical services, including those critical for sexual and reproductive health. Lithuania stands firmly with the UN's commitment to put an end to sexual violence in conflict situations. We fully support the efforts of Special Representative Pramila Patten and Special Representative Virginia Gamba. The government of Lithuania has been continuously providing financial contributions to the UN action against sexual violence in conflict. We're keen on strengthening our cooperation and exploring additional collective initiatives aimed at holding perpetrators accountable, including Russia for their actions while ensuring a survivor-centered approach. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ambassador. We now hand the floor to expert from the Permanent Mission of Latvia. You have the floor.
Thank you very much. Thank you to the co-hosts for organizing this event. Thank you for the presentations. Latvia's approach to CRSV is to help at home, help abroad, and help the international organizations. At home, we help refugees by providing survivor-centered services in our hospitals or in our rehabilitation centers. Abroad, in partnership with women, civil society organizations, we have opened rehabilitation centers in Ukraine, where survivors can get medical, psychological, and also legal help. At the International Criminal Court, we support the prosecutor's office financially and also with experts to help gather evidence on war crimes, including sexual violence, and at the United Nations. We support politically and also financially all the appropriate offices and all the agencies so they can do their job on this important matter. I thank you.
Thank you very much. We now hand the floor to a Permanent Mission of Senegal expert. Thank you. You have the floor.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. And my name is Fatou, and let me tell you that I am really honored to attend this event to commemorate the 10th official observance of the International Day for the Elimination of Sexual Violence. Conflict-related sexual violence is indeed a grave violation of human rights and a serious threat to international peace and security. To combat this terrible practice, the international community, especially the UN, must take comprehensive and coordinated actions. We must categorically ensure robust implementation of existing international laws and advocate for the universal ratification and enforcement of the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court, ICC, which categorize rape and other forms of sexual violence as war crimes and crimes against humanity. In addition, we need to encourage member and observer states to enact and enforce national laws that criminalize sexual violence in conflict. Most importantly, member states have to develop national action plans in line with UNSCR 1325 to address CRSV, ensuring they include measures for prevention, protection, and prosecution. A global advocacy campaign is also needed to raise awareness about CRSV among governments, military personnel, and the general public. In doing so, we must use media, social media platforms, and international forums to disseminate information and promote zero tolerance for CRSV. The culture of impunity needs to cease now. The International Day for the Elimination of Sexual Violence is observed annually, which offers a fantastic chance to increase awareness of the phenomena of sexual violence or rape. It's a good opportunity to alarm and put a stop to conflict-related sexual assault, which predominantly targets women and girls, and even men and boys. They are directly or indirectly impacted and can result in human suffering, loss of life, destruction of infrastructure, and social economic implications. That's the reason why we have the obligation to stand apart with the victims and survivors who require support and health protection. Ensure that survivors have access to medical care, psychological support, legal aid, and safe shelters. This includes immediate health care for physical injuries and long-term mental health support to address trauma. The United Nations has the responsibility to protect the healthcare infrastructures to prevent and avoid their destructions. Commemorating the International Day for Elimination of Sexual Violence in Conflict is a crucial opportunity to use social media, traditional media, and public events to highlight stories of survivors, educate the public on the impact of CRSV, and of course, mobilize global support. By combining these strategies, the international community can take meaningful steps forwards, ending the culture of impunity surrounding CRSV, providing robust support for survivors. So let's pay respect and support survivors of sexual violence conflict-related, but most importantly, hold accountable individuals or groups who committed conflict-related violence, and individuals or parties responsible for such war crimes must be held accountable. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I hand the floor to the expert from the Dominican Republic. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I would like to start thanking Argentina, SRSG Patton, SRSG Gamba, and your team for gathering us today to commemorate this day, and also to the panelists and to the survivor for sharing their insights. Conflict-related sexual violence is a painful scourge that has worsened in several conflict scenarios. Sexual violence continues to be used as a tactic of terror, torture, intimidation, and political repression, and a ruthless tool of forced displacement and the humanization of innocent and vulnerable people, deeply affecting their physical, sexual, reproductive, and mental health, and destroying the social fabric of communities and societies. Attacks on civilian infrastructure, including health facilities, are intensifying, depriving communities of fundamental rights such as access to health services. The destruction of health facilities and attacks on health workers severely hamper the provision of life-saving care for survivors of sexual violence. Women and girls, already disproportionately affected by conflict-related sexual violence, face additional barriers when trying to access health services, including sexual and reproductive health services, treatment for sexually transmitted infections, and psychological support. These barriers are compounded by fear, stigma, and prevailing insecurity. Let us not get tired of calling for double efforts to protect medical facilities and health personnel in conflict zones, to call for the implementation of strict measures to ensure that hospitals and clinics can operate without fear of attack, and for humanitarian corridors to be established for safe delivery of medical supplies. Moreover, the transnational nature of conflict and sexual violence demands a coordinated and robust response at the international level, and accountability must be at the cornerstone of our fight against conflict-related sexual violence. At the same time, it is essential to focus on the needs and rights of women and girls, and to persevere in the fight for gender equality and the full respect and enjoyment of their human rights. We would thus like to recognize also the work of women's civil society organizations that are often the first to respond in times of war and conflict against all odds. We reiterate the commitment of the Dominican Republic to continue advocating for a world free of sexual violence in the presence or absence of war. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. We turn the floor to the expert from the Permanent Mission of Ukraine. Thank you.
Thank you so much. First of all, thank you to all organizers for convening this important and truly on heartbreaking topic event, and for all the briefers for sharing their insightful briefings and recommendations with us. As we just heard, the reality is very grim today. The outbreak and escalation of conflict expose civilians to increased levels of conflict-related sexual violence, intentionally used to terrorize communities and dismantle the social fabric. And these despicable crimes inflict lasting trauma on survivors and their families. For my country, Ukraine, the topic is highly relevant. And as the UN at the moment has verified that Russia systematically uses sexual violence as a weapon against Ukrainian civilians and prisoners of war. reaching levels of brutality that shock even seasoned experts. Testimonies from individuals released from Russian captivity reveals that almost 90% of detainees endured torture, rape, or other form of sexual abuse. Egregious war crimes are being committed daily against Ukrainians who are in the temporarily occupied territories. To date, Ukrainian prosecutors have documented more than 300 cases of conflict-related sexual violence, including against 15 children. However, these figures likely only scratch the surface due to underreporting and limited access to the occupied territories. We also grateful for specifically highlighting the impact of attacks on healthcare facilities, because at the moment, more than 1,500 medical facilities across Ukraine were damaged, with 200 completely destroyed due to the unabated Russian attacks. We are resolute in the commitment to ensuring accountability for all these heinous crimes and to providing all necessary assistance to survivors. We firmly believe that the Russian army and Russian law enforcement agencies such as FSB belong on a list as parties to the conflict reliably suspected of committing acts of rape and other forms of sexual violence. We heartfully appreciate the international community's support, which amplifies our resolve. And we are particularly grateful to all the donors and especially to the UNFPA for their activities on the ground. At the moment, we have 12 stationed and 3 mobile survivor relief centers opened across the country to provide various services for the survivors of the conflict-related sexual violence. Together with the Global Survivors Fund, the government of Ukraine has launched a pilot project on urgent interim reparation for the survivors of conflict-related sexual violence in Ukraine, because survivors cannot wait for decades. They need help and support and justice now. To conclude, the message is clear: sexual violence in conflict will not be tolerated, and all those who commit such egregious crimes will be prosecuted and held accountable. Thank you.
Thank you. I now hand the floor over to Croatia, Permanent Mission of Croatia, our last speaker of the day. Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you for organizing this important event. Excellencies, distinguished briefers, we commemorate this year's International Day for the Elimination of Violence Against Women in a global context of escalating violence and rising insecurity. The Secretary General's reports demonstrate that, despite all the advances made in international law, conflict-related sexual and gender-based violence remain pervasive as ever, and impunity still represents a significant barrier to justice and peace. Structural inequalities and state fragility further expose women and girls, while the latest report on children and armed conflict shows an alarming increase of conflict-related sexual violence perpetrated against children, 25% higher than in the previous year. It is deplorable that in some instances survivors do not have access to adequate medical and mental care, as hospitals have become increasingly targeted by parties to conflict. Attacks on hospitals threaten the safety of medical personnel and patients, depriving communities of their right to health services and exposing vulnerable groups to heightened risks of further violence. This year, we also mark the 75th anniversary of the Geneva Conventions, the cornerstone of civilian protection in armed conflict, reminding us of the global commitment to protect civilians and uphold the principles of humanity. Croatia condemns all forms of conflict-related sexual violence and strongly encourages all states to align their laws with international humanitarian law and international human rights law and monitor their compliance with relevant Security Council resolutions. It is our responsibility to use all available tools to ensure the protection of civilian infrastructure in conflict areas. We must persist in our efforts to prevent conflicts and build peace through the support for civil society, whose role is critical in advocating for peace, long-term development, and gender justice. Finally, it is only through the joint efforts of individual countries and international and local organizations that we can secure the full implementation of the existing frameworks and the national action plans. They represent key tools that we must insist on in order to strengthen the response to conflict-related sexual violence and ultimately put an end to it, as stated in the landmark resolution from 2008. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I understand that Ambassador, yes, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Just very briefly, I would like to thank all the distinguished permanent representative and colleagues that have spoken. I think that it's very important that everybody had the opportunity to present its position, and we've been able to hear all the voices. So thank you very much again, and thank you for all the members of the panel, and thank you. Good morning.
Thank you. The meeting is adjourned. Thank you so much.